So if you're just joining us again, my name is Cynthia Gordigiwa and I'm ProPublica's marketing director. Welcome to Not Shutting Up the News Now. Today, we'll be talking about how ProPublica and our news agenda is pivoting and in some ways not pivoting in this moment as the nation continues to grapple with COVID-19, economic recovery, not to mention a new president in the White House. There's a lot going on, and we have a great panel here to help guide us through ProPublica's priorities and how we're looking at the news now. By the way, this is the first edition of a new ProPublica event series designed just for donors. Periodically, we'll be hosting intimate conversations like this one between you and our leadership. As a nonprofit independent newsroom, our investigative journalism is only possible with the support of donors like you. And on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you for your generosity. Now on to the program. With us today, we have Stephen Engelberg, ProPublica Editor-in-Chief, Robin Fields, ProPublica's Managing Editor, and our moderator, ProPublica President Richard Tofel. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, just type it into the Q&A box. And I'll be back for that audience Q&A portion, but first I'll throw it over to ProPublica's President Richard Tofel. Richard?
Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're very much looking forward to this conversation. Steve and Robin, let me start with you, Steve. So we pivoted in our news priorities, obviously, considerably in response to the 2016 election. Can you talk a little bit about that and why, but then with a focus on, obviously, how are we pivoting again with the new administration and the new news agenda this year?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for that introduction, Cynthia, and also thank our donors for their generosity, which we are, aware of each and every day. We absolutely can't do it without you. The 2016, a lot of our European friends would say that there's no real political differences in America, that from the perspective of a European, everyone in America is in the same place. I think 2016 was quite provably not that. We had a candidate who won the election who had a very, very different set of priorities and intended to use his office and the powers of his office to execute. And so that did require us to do some shifting of what we were going to be covering. We, as of 2016, surprisingly did not have a full-time immigration reporter. We can cover that as a regular beat. We certainly did after the election of Donald Trump, and we probably should have been before. We had a reporter that we hired who went out to cover the effect of trade deals and the effect of trade policy on Americans, which was not previously a beat. The President of the United States was running a massive business, which he left to his family without the usual firewalls that exist when a president comes in and puts things in certain kinds of blind trust. That obviously wasn't possible when you have a business and you weren't going to sell it. So we had a team of people looking at the possible connections between the president, his businesses, and his family. So all along the way, as we know, the election of President Trump made a substantial difference in our political culture and, frankly, the policy culture. And so that changed our priorities. Interestingly enough, coming into 2020, many of these things still remain, perhaps in different forms. We cover immigration today with more people than we did in 2017. It remains an issue that I think is going to be on the agenda of every president going forward, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, whether it's Trump 4 years from now or some Democrat or Biden himself. What is happening at the border is not something that's in control of the American president. And so therefore, how that plays out is going to be very newsworthy for us and a good subject of investigative reporting. I think the issue of climate, which we sort of had started before the Trump years and have stuck with, is absolutely not going away. And we now have a president who's put it top of the agenda. And our approach to climate, frankly, has been to look at what works. We have not much written about the argument over what's happening or what the cause is, but more looking at the efficacy of the solutions. And we have a reporter assigned to that, and we have other reporters working on that subject as well. So, I mean, to some extent, a new president means new priorities, but I think to some extent, a new president in this case means doubling down and digging deeper on things that we already know are important to people.
Robin, uh, how have, what have you seen as the big surprises, if any, of the news agenda, or as you've gone into this year? And also, can you talk a little bit about sort of our modes of reporting and how that's changed between the height of the pandemic and now?
I think that when we all got hit by the pandemic in the early part of the spring in 2020, we shifted our staff into a much sort of faster pace. And because we realized something so important had happened that it needed to become the focus of almost the entire staff, which we'd never done before. And I think that the pace at which things were changing was dictating how quickly we needed to sort of be writing about things. Whereas before, we tended to take extended periods to dig very, very deeply into things. I think what we're in right now is sort of almost a period in which there's a little bit of both, sort of both the pace and the news focus of the pandemic, and in the case of earlier this year, things like the attack on the Capitol, and the continued racial reckoning, and also sort of an ability to try to begin to gear up for more of the deep dive, longer term work we've done in the past.
And how do you, as editors, think about how to balance those two kinds of things, the short term and the long term, as you think about assigning individual staff or the overall news mix? What are the kinds of factors that go into that for the two of you?
Robert?
Do you want to start, Steve?
Sure, why not? I mean, I think, we know a couple of things about this subject. We are an organization that was designed by our founders, the Sandlers, to aim to do journalism that has impact. And to do that, you have to come up with original ideas, and you have to approach them in a very disciplined and serious way, and it takes time. So we know that we can't assign a reporter to a big project today, and then tomorrow say, well, what about the Capitol? And then say, what about the vaccine? And then say, what about the Russians? And if you do that, what you end up with is a kind of merry-go-round of very shallow stories that are somewhat similar to what's being done elsewhere. That's not what ProPublica is about. The idea of ProPublica is to do stories that you can't get anywhere else, and to remain as focused as is needed to bring change. And so that could be years of work. Having said that, I mean, I think both Robin and I are constantly sort of looking over our shoulder at the news environment. There are moments where you would be a lunatic if you stuck to your plan. As Robin said earlier, COVID was one of those moments. In 2008, we had barely founded ProPublica and had just started a raft of projects when we had the financial meltdown. We continued a number of those projects, but we also assigned reporters to begin learning about things that none of them had ever heard of, like collateralized debt obligations. And so, you have to live in the world that we are in. And I think you can certainly, try to have, to some extent, this is a classic editor's approach, to have your cake and eat it too. We can have our wonderful projects, and we can continue to do stories that make news. Right, Robin?
Right. But I think that your point about staying focused on things that are accountability driven and the areas in which we can be additive, I think is critical to our thinking at all times.
How do you tell, or what are sort of some of the factors that go into thinking about, is this moment we're in one of those in which a lot of things are changing, or is it just the daily craziness? I mean, if you watch cable television, one of the things that amazes me, right, is you have the same breaking news banner if it's an event that people will remember in 50 years or will have forgotten by tomorrow morning. So we've had 3 or 4 of these moments at ProPublica, and you all have managed to pivot very quickly, but you don't do it. You haven't done it 50 or 100 or 2,000 times. So how do you tell when it's one of those times?
I think that, look, I don't think anybody's arrogant enough to believe that they're always right about these things. And you can always jump in even if you wait a beat and then decide. But I think when you're confronted with something that sweeps up huge numbers of people, like the financial crisis in 08, 09, like COVID, I think your instinct has to be, this is going to affect so many people, and the potential for harm is great, and the potential for mistakes is great. I think that then sort of makes you think we need to go do our jobs here.
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of gut feeling thing, and there are times where we have passed on things initially and later jumped in. One of the questions we would ask, as Robin mentioned, is, how many people are affected by this? Is this something that becomes a sort of new universal experience for everybody? Another question is, do we have particular expertise? There was a moment in the early part of the Trump years where the major publications that we consider our peers jumped in with both feet to try to examine the so-called Trump-Russia connection. That was a story that was going to be primarily built on leaks from the FBI or from the intelligence agencies. We have some people who do that work, but nowhere near as many as, say, the New York Times. And we didn't really necessarily feel that that was the way we wanted to think about the new administration, or even questions about Donald Trump. But there were other things we could do that we were better suited to. So instead, we made an alliance with WNYC in New York and created this podcast called Trump Inc., which did, as I mentioned earlier, look at questions about the family business and its history and how it was benefiting or not benefiting from the leader of the business being the president of the United States. Those were questions we felt we could add something to. For one thing, one of his properties was literally next door to our office. So, you should always cover things in your local neighborhood.
Right. It feels like people are beginning to reflect, even though obviously it's far from over, on the pandemic and lessons learned. If you all took a first look back, again, admitting that there's still road ahead, how do you feel about our pandemic coverage and about pandemic coverage generally?
I think that what I look back most proudly at about our pandemic coverage is that we were on a number of things pretty quickly. And one of them was the issues with testing, which have continued to be issues throughout the pandemic. One was the issues of racial inequity, and that the costs and tolls of the pandemic would essentially land unequally. And then there were some other areas too, where I felt like we really recognized accountability issues, quite quickly and sort of took them up. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think if you think about, I agree with what you said about our coverage. I think in general, the press to this day, if we want to call ourselves the press, the media, continue to struggle with very complicated questions of statistics and epidemiology, which frankly epidemiologists disagree about. And so this is very, very frustrating for readers. And, we all remember, because this isn't a new thought, I challenge anyone on this call to remember whether coffee is good or bad for you according to science, right? Because it changes every other week. There's a new study out. And, how do you lose weight? Is it carbs? Is it not carbs? These things go on and on and on. But say again?
Totally carbs.
Totally carbs. Okay. So, but, these things go on and on and on with very worthy scientists and very worthy peer-reviewed journals giving different opinions. We're all kind of used to that. Suddenly it's life or death. Do I go to work? Can I go see my grandmother at the nursing home? How often do I have to wear a mask? How dangerous is this? What are my chances of dying? And every single day we learn something new. I just circulated to our colleagues moments ago a story that said that they have now discovered that if you were pregnant, and the chances of getting COVID when you were pregnant is the same as anyone else, i.e., depending on the circulation at the time, high or low, depending on where you are. But once you get it, you're 20 times more likely to have serious illness if you're pregnant. 20 times. That is an entirely new frontier of understanding of this disease. And I would think, assuming the scientific study is accurate, this is actionable. If you're pregnant, your thoughts about the vaccine should be very different from anybody else's given these numbers. That broke an hour ago. And, is it true? I'm not sure. It's might be. Do we tell everybody about it? Do we start doing pregnant women's stories and looking at the numbers ourselves? Possibly. But that's where we are. We're in this very messy place where science is being, created day by day, hour by hour. And we in the press are trying to explain it. We have, frankly, struggled to understand some of it ourselves. And then, what do we tell people that they can read a story and walk away and know what to do? And I think that was a challenge that we answered some of the time, but not always.
And how much responsibility do you think the press needs to take for, and now generally, for the sort of obvious mistakes that were made last year? I mean, the biggest mistake I think that there's now no real disagreement about is the government did not warn people to wear masks. I looked this up today until April 3rd last year, which was 3 weeks after many, many people's businesses shut down, and months after people had their first warnings about this. Is that something that is the responsibility solely of officialdom, or is there some need to look back on the part of the news media? How do you think about that, again, at this early stage?
Well, go ahead, Robin.
No, I was going to leave it to you.
I don't have a great answer either. I mean, I think the question is, Dick, is it reasonable to expect that people in the news media can sometimes be as smart or even smarter than sort of what the official advice is that's being doled out? And the answer is, you betcha. I think that's the bar we set for ourselves. We believe that we are an independent check potentially on all sorts of things that happen. You can have somebody say, some official government agency say to you that, who says you need to wear seatbelts? It's 50-50. Who says smoking causes cancer? Is it journalistically, reasonable to say, well, if the government isn't telling you anything about cancer, maybe that's because the cigarette industry is lobbied in a certain way, and maybe we need to step in and say something? I think absolutely yes. But it's a tough thing to ask us to be as smart or smarter than some of the experts. If you go back even further, I would say that once Wuhan shut down by early January, I mean, there should have been a clarion alarm in America being raised by every expert and every news organization in the land. This thing was clearly not as benign as the experts were saying. It couldn't have been. How on earth did it spread through a city that fast? And when it hit Italy, I mean, what were we thinking? We were sitting here saying, God, if it gets here, it's going to be bad. It was already in Italy, as if there were no flights from Italy to New York, which we now know, of course, there were. So I think it's reasonable to expect, but hard. Right.
Let's shift gears a little bit. One question, we asked some people to submit questions in advance of this, or the invitees, and some of them were about the issue of nonpartisanship. Or partisanship. And we say every time we get a chance, and I know we mean, that ProPublica is nonpartisan. What does that mean to the two of you?
I think what it means to me is that we come into stories with questions as opposed to sort of a prefab conclusion, and that we genuinely, try to keep an open mind whenever we come into something. It doesn't add up to much more than being fair. And I think that you always want to be fair because there is no good journalism that isn't fair. So I think that that's what I think of when so many things are politicized, and you just simply cannot allow yourself to come in having made up your mind or having assumptions or doing things that are essentially commentary instead of evidence-based. Everything from our standpoint needs to be driven by evidence and by facts.
Yeah, and I think there are some general truths about our line of work, and one of them is that we question the decisions, we examine the decisions made by those in power. You could certainly say, if you looked at the last 4 years, that we were very skeptical of some of the things the Trump administration said. But if you look at the previous 8 years, the Obama administration was not entirely a ProPublica fan. Let me assure our donors, recent donors, or maybe not so recent donors, we wrote a lot of very critical stories about things that the Obama administration did, and they were quite angry about them. So, I think we hope that our reporters and our editors start from the perspective not of left or right or Democrat or Republican, but is something broken and can it be done better? And those seem to be questions that transcend the partisan argument.
And what about questions of what's come to be called in many quarters false equivalence? Are there at least two sides to every question? And how do you tell when there's not?
Again, I go back to evidence and proof. I don't think that things. Let's take something like climate. The evidence is not equal on both sides of that debate. And I don't think that it would be appropriate to treat it as if it were. And there are, similar things in every aspect of, a political argument or a political debate. And I don't think that you should allow yourself to get sucked into sort of that equivalency, false equivalencies. I think you should, pay attention when there are real equivalencies, but not false ones.
Yeah, I mean, there are moments, and I think we have to acknowledge this, where the wisdom that we all think is not only conventional, but maybe factual, turns out to be wrong. I mean, that does happen. People do assume and say things about how the economy will behave or how people will behave and so on, that just simply are not true. So I think you always want to sort of at least ask the question, if there are two sides, what might they look like? And, if one is overwhelmingly, seemingly weighted, are we really giving appropriate weight to the other? But I mean, I had a very lengthy interaction with a prominent person years ago who was convinced that, childhood vaccination causes autism. I don't believe every story that we write about children or autism or vaccination needs to give equal weight to that viewpoint, because frankly, there is no science behind it. And I am prepared to say that. I was also prepared when this gentleman said, but there's new science you haven't read, to actually spend some time clicking through the new science to persuade myself that it was no better than the old science. So I think, the willingness to engage another viewpoint doesn't mean you have to give it equal weight. We should be prepared to be challenged.
So our work is obviously, and we always say that it's closely related to democracy, that we regarded journalism as having an important role in democratic governance. So I want to talk for a minute or two about how this applies to the issue of voting. There are, frankly, a lot of efforts abroad in the land to restrict some people's right to vote. How does one approach that as a news organization? And how do you all think about it as editors?
I think that the way I've tended to approach it is, again, to look at things like allegations of voter fraud in terms of what evidence is there to support or refute that this is a widespread issue. There does not seem to be any significant evidence that it is a serious and widespread problem. And then you ask the question, well, then why do so many people think it is? And why do they think that they want to change the systems in various ways to prevent it? Again, it's, much like I was talking about before, I approach it with questions. And I do think that, the upshot of looking at those questions has been, continuing to find that there's very little evidence of widespread voter fraud. And the evidence of obstacles to voting, hurdles to voting has tended to be more substantial. And thus, that's the way we might go into, looking at these issues and where we might want to focus versus where we might not. But again, as Steve says, you always, if there's supposedly new evidence, you look at that new evidence with an open mind.
And as an investigative reporting outfit, what we're really trying to do is find out, in many cases, the hidden forces that are behind things. So if you see in 30 states at once a series of identically worded laws that are designed to curtail the universal suffrage that we thought we'd agreed to back in the day, that's something worth looking at and maybe trying to understand who's doing it, who's paying for it, and what their motivations are. It is surprising and amazing with a lot of the new technologies that are available these days, between all the emails people send each other and all the meetings they have where their colleagues are tape recording them. We can sometimes learn a lot more these days than we used to about the internal workings of various seemingly impregnable institutions. And I think good investigative reporting should not only explain the what, but the why and the who and the how. And so these are things that, and we have just at the moment advertised a job with a very broad, purview of covering democracy. We were interviewing candidates just before this meeting, and it clearly is a job you could take in a number of directions, but we would certainly hope that the direction you mentioned here, Dick, is one direction we would be examining.
So relatedly, and I think maybe one last question before we throw it open to the audience. Relatedly, look, Donald Trump rebelled in positioning himself as oppositional to the one. How should a news organization respond to that? Does one engage? How do you think? How did you think about that? And what do you think what kind of legacy does that leave us with now that he's no longer in power?
A couple of quick thoughts there for those who may not know where the name of this session comes from. Dick used to write a column, and now I've picked up the mantle called "Not Shutting Up." And Dick did famously tweet back when Steve Bannon said that the press should just shut up, that we were not going to be shutting up. So I think on the one hand, we can position ourselves to be, forthrightly, in the conversation about what's happening and who's doing what to whom. I am very uncomfortable wanting to be ever positioned, and I know the president wanted us to be such, as the opposition. I don't think that is the right place to be, because then when the next crowd comes in, they expect you to be the loyal supporters. And I don't want to be either the opposition or the supporters. I want to follow stories where they lead us. But we don't intend to shut up.
All right. With that, however, I'm going to do a little shutting up and pass it to you, Cynthia, to bring in our audience questions.
Perfect segue, Dick. I'm seeing a lot of story ideas in the question box, and also a relevant question to that. So I'm going to start there. If someone has a story idea, who do they address that to? And I would add, not only where do they send story ideas, but can you tell us what sort of makes for a more helpful or a more strong pitch? And like, what kinds of things are you looking for? Because I know you get a lot of pitches every week. So if you can direct us to, like, where can people send those ideas, and what makes for a strong story idea that you get?
I think that, do we still have the suggestions set up that we?
Yeah, so the email is tips@propublica.org.
That's TIPS.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah, so we absolutely do read those and accept them with great enthusiasm. I think that the things that help us recognize that something might be worth looking into are specificity, an understanding of what's new about what you're telling us, as opposed to what has been out there on similar issues. Any type of documentation that you may have that something is happening, and a notion of, who, from a system standpoint, as opposed to, one individual, might be harmed by something. There are certainly times when we write about a great wrong experienced by one person. But I think we tend to be drawn to stories about bad systems that have a larger potential for harm. What do you look for, Steve?
Well, I actually fear this subject immensely, as you know, because there are many famous stories in the history of journalism. A gentleman named Edward Snowden once sent a tip line at the New York Times, which was ignored, and then he went to the Washington Post. So I am always terrified that somebody out there on this call or elsewhere will send us an incredible tip that we somehow won't recognize the quality of. But so having said that, please do send them, and we will do our very best to recognize it. As you said, I mean, specificity is very helpful. Understanding sort of the number of people touched by something is very helpful, because that is, how we think about it. There is just a certain sometimes luck and magic in all of us. At one point, several years ago, somebody sent a tip to my email, a person I didn't know. He said he was a city official in New York, and there was a terrible scam going on, and it was very complicated. But if he came in with his shoeboxes full of stuff, he could explain it. And so I sent it to one of our new reporters, and he said, "I'll talk to this guy." And it was actually a really, really, really good story. He was absolutely right. It was a scandal. And he came in with shoeboxes, and we spent like 6 months on it. So I would certainly encourage anybody who's listening to this, if they feel they know something we should be looking at, to send it. I will say, in all honesty, Robin is an incredibly efficient managing editor. It is her job to make sure every single person in the place is engaged in an incredibly important project at all times. And so it might take us a little bit to get to some of these things because everybody is working hard. But if it's a really important tip, I would like to think that we will recognize it and we will do it.
Great. And that email again, audience, is tips, TIPS, @ProPublica.org. And it actually goes automatically to the inboxes of our senior editors. It's not like a separate inbox that they have to check. That's why there was a little bit of confusion about what the email address was, because they just get it automatically. And I also had another question here about encrypted tips.
Mm-hmm.
We have a whole page all about that at ProPublica.org/tips, which tells you all the different ways to send us stories securely, including encrypted email. So please also read ProPublica.org/tips. It's a page about how to send us stories. Okay, so our next question, nice and simple one, but a couple of people have had this one. How many reporters does ProPublica have?
So it's a very simple question with a slightly complicated answer. But the bottom line is, at this point, well more than 80. We've got probably a total of about, something approaching 30 reporters in our local or regional efforts around the country, now focused on the Midwest, the South, the Southwest, and our joint initiative with the Texas Tribune on Texas. Then there are our national staff who are increasingly spread around the country. We've now got reporters based in more than 20 states around the country. And then there are our local reporting project partners who are reporters based at other local news organizations around the country that we support with donor money through a series of 1 year, or in a few cases, 3-year grants that we make to support those reporters' work, and then support them with editorial and other resources and publish that work jointly.
So sort of speaking about some of our regional hubs that we have now, we have a question about someone who's especially interested in Georgia and Florida, who asks, what will ProPublica's new reporters in the South be focusing on during the next year? I'm not sure if that's really been decided just yet, because we're still staffing up, but if there's any preview that you might be able to give.
Robin, you want to?
I actually think that that's still being decided, because they've only started within the last couple of weeks. I think they have some ideas about that actually are related to something we talked about before, which is covering threats to democracy. Obviously, issues of voting and the new bill that was just passed in Georgia are very much on everybody's minds, but there are issues throughout the South having to do with both that and redistricting efforts that I think that are going to be at least the subject matter for one reporter in the South to look at. I also think that there is another reporter there who may focus on criminal justice.
Okay. Next question. How are you adapting your in-depth investigative stories into bite-sized written and multimedia content for audiences with limited sustained attention opportunities?
Yes, a very good question, an excellent question. We are a newsroom of people whose editors and reporters mostly come from sort of what you might call traditional media. They're magazine journalists, they're newspaper journalists. We do like to write long stories in text, which we hope that everybody reads each and every word of. However, we understand the world isn't quite built that way. So today, yesterday, Robin and I saw a presentation from our audience team about what ProPublica TikTok is going to look like. And so stay tuned. We're inventing it right as we speak, but it is, they proved to us in this presentation that it is actually possible to tell a lot about a story in 40 to 45 seconds of TikTok video, or several in a row if you need that. So we are constantly looking at different ways of storytelling. We have some 900,000 plus Twitter followers. We have an active Facebook presence. And we are, thinking about all of these things because, it is clear that the sort of existence of a 5,000 word text story on a screen will appeal to a percentage of the readers, and that percentage is likely to drop over time. And so I think we need to be aware of this, and we are trying to be aware of it. Dick, in addition to being the president of the company, used to be our general counsel and is a lawyer, and I think he would be the first to say, no matter how snappy and short things get, they still have to be fair from a legal perspective. And so we still have to include in anything we do the level of balance that we put in our investigative stories. And so there's a little bit of a challenge in some of these new things, which, are brief, but we're working on it.
Twitter, I learned, has this wonderful, TikTok, I learned, has this wonderful thing where you pause and you can actually freeze text on the screen. And people can keep going. This helps solve that problem particularly.
Hey, so we're seeing a number of questions about racial inequality. So the question more specifically, what do you see as ProPublica's role in taking on systemic racism, or the role of the press in general?
Robin, you want to start on that?
Sure. I think that we see our principal role as doing stories that illuminate those issues where we find them. That is one of the sort of deepest things that goes through all of our reporting that surfaced in one area after another. Certainly that was the case during COVID. I think we also have done a fair bit of reporting in the last year about issues of race and NYPD. I think that racial injustice is part of so many areas that we cover and so many stories that we do that I think that we don't see it necessarily as a distinct beat in and of itself, but something that's woven into any number of beats, although we have had a beat. I think we had a reporter covering race for, quite a while. The other thing is we don't see our role as being advocacy. And I think that, we see our role as doing journalism about issues like inequality. And fundamentally, we don't step outside of that, and we don't do commentary, we don't do opinion. We do the kinds of stories that hold people accountable. And that's how I think we come at this.
We also, I'd like to point to two stories in our one in our past and one in our more recent past. I think we are capable with our data team of discovering inequality that nobody else knows about. racial divisions that literally are not in plain sight at all. We did a project early in the existence of ProPublica, where we looked at the question of presidential pardons, and we were able to pull a statistically representative sample of people who applied and divided by race, and we discovered that white applicants for presidential pardons, all things being equal, including if you adjusted for the crimes they did, the sentences they had, and anything else you could find, were roughly 4 times as likely to get a presidential pardon than similar African Americans. That is a finding nobody knew. I mean, you might have felt looking at the list, wow, that seems like an awful lot of white people, but how would you know? And we were able to put a number on that. It didn't generate at the time enough outrage for the President of the United States to change the system. And then, of course, we know what happened to the pardon system under President Trump. But I think Biden has an opportunity here to go back and think about that. The same thing with an algorithm that was supposed to predict criminality. We went down to Florida, we got the numbers and said, okay, let's see what happened. Let's get the scores. You know, does this thing accurately predict? Well, it didn't. It over-predicted criminality by Black people and, interestingly, women by a substantial amount. And so we were able to expose something that nobody even knew was there. And I think that's where ProPublica plays a role in combating systemic racism, which is by bringing to light things that are happening that maybe nobody even saw.
Thank you. What can be done about the absence of local media operations due to consolidation? How can ProPublica help local media operations? I know there's a lot to say there.
Robin, why don't you start? As Elizabeth Warren once said, we do have a plan for that.
You know, that is one of the things that has, you know, the sort of shrinking of local media has been one of the themes across the 13 or 14 years that we've been around. There's just been a dramatic decline. And I think that one of the things that we were created to do was to try to fill gaps in in-depth, accountability-driven journalism, and the need for that at the local level has really just become almost incredible. And the way that we've approached that is in 2 ways. One is the local units that Dick talked about, that we created first with ProPublica Illinois, which has become our Midwestern unit, and then our effort with the Texas Tribune in Texas, and then subsequently these units that we're creating in the South and the Southwest. Those folks are essentially ProPublica staffers, and they're, you know, with us permanently, and we hope for those units to sort of take root much in the way that the whole organization has taken root, and for those reporters to do important stories that make a difference and bring change in those places that otherwise wouldn't have been done. The second thing, though, that we've done is we launched a project called the Local Reporting Network. What year was that? Did we launch that, Dick?
2018.
That was 2018, so 3 years ago. And what we do in the Local Reporting Network is we put out a request for local publications and local reporters to propose 1-year projects. And then we pick a group of, you know, up to 6 or 7, and we fund them. And we fund those reporters for a year to give them sort of the time, and by working with us, the resources to do very ambitious, you know, meaningful work that they otherwise wouldn't have a chance to do. You know, the Local Reporting Network was sort of proof that there's plenty of great investigative story ideas out there. What there isn't is the resources to do them. And so we've used that way of working with other publications to try to bring that work into reality. So I think that's what we're trying to do. And we certainly think that there's ample room to do more of it.
Okay. So I have a specific question about a story that we did following the Capitol insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have to hire extra staff to comb through Parler on the Capitol insurrection? And can you just talk about the coverage generally over that? Like what what was the ProPublica entryway into this big national story? How did you guys make the decision to cover that?
Well, Robin has been answering questions, but the truth of the matter was I decided to take the week of January 6th off. So she organized the coverage. So I'm going to let Robin talk about it because it's a guarantee that if I take a week off, something terrible happens.
Yes, Steve cannot take any time. Although we have urged him to think about self-care at the same time. But we are the head of our news apps operation was able sort of got this huge trove of Parler videos. And the first thing was, oh my gosh, this is an overwhelming amount of stuff. How are we going to begin to go through it? So we decided to look very specifically at the day of the insurrection at the Capitol. And at that point, we still had, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos to look through. And so we put out a call to the entire reporting staff and asked if they, if some of them could watch some of these videos and help us identify the ones that were most instructive and, essentially which ones had happened when and so forth. And to my amazement, pretty much everybody volunteered. Dozens and dozens of ProPublica reporters reviewed videos. And that's how we were able to put together, with the help of, everyone on the news apps team, who built this app probably faster than we built anything ever. To be able to give this app to the public at a moment when they really needed it, and it really could make a difference in terms of their thinking on what had happened that day. And I think that that's how we went about trying to make sense of this giant pile of videos, some of which really changed how we thought about what went on that day. Does that give some?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that because the folks here obviously are supporters of ProPublica. They understand what we do, but just to put it in sort of the context of journalism culture, most newspapers used to have, not anymore, a sort of separate group of investigative reporters who were on sort of like this dream team. And they got to spend a long time on projects while other people had to write 2 stories a day. And there was always a little bit of resentment of that group. Now that most of those people are now gone because the papers are all downsized. But at ProPublica, we don't have that because everybody's on the investigative team. We all belong to the group of people who have the privilege of working, at a great length of time on very complicated things. So when something big happens, at least so far, we're still small-ish. We're still a little bit like a startup, and people leap in to help their colleagues in ways that I've never seen anywhere else. And so that was a really exciting moment to frankly watch from afar. I was told they were going to have to read, watch literally thousands of videos, and then just seeing the emails of people volunteering to do it was really, incredibly inspiring. And that is the staff that we have. That is the group of people that you're supporting here, which is a group that sees a larger purpose beyond their own promotion. As I like to tell people, since we don't have a Paris bureau yet, there's nothing to fight about. Now, when we start that, who knows what will happen?
I just want to add a couple of quick facts about this. One is at the bottom of this story, you can see the list of the staff who contributed to it. And I think it is literally 50 people long. Second, if you haven't seen this feature yet, this collection of the Parler videos, it's an astonishing, not only editorial achievement, it's astonishing technological achievement because you can basically watch the events of the day unfold through this curated set of 500 videos taken by participants, placed in chronological order. So you have, sort of a real-time documentary of the whole thing unfolding. And the third quick point is, as Steve has mentioned a number of times, and I think Robin has as well, we're in the business of producing impact. And already a number of prosecutions have cited to this collection of videos in prosecuting or attempting to prosecute participants in the insurrection and the managers of the second Trump impeachment made specific and repeated reference to this story on the floor in the course of that. So if you haven't seen it yet, I think it's really very much worth a look.
I'll drop a link to that actually in the chat option for the audience in a moment. Okay, next question is, are there any plans to expand internationally, particularly in countries where investigative journalism is threatened or non-existent?
Well, again, as I said, the Paris Bureau awaits, and we're going to need a chief, so I'm ready. But no, we have repeatedly talked about this question. It is something that I'm sure will come back in the coming years. It is tempting. It is interesting. You see a number of questions where a number of countries where democracy is truly threatened. There are people in those countries, by the way, trying to start ProPublica-like organizations. Dick and I frequently talk to them. We've talked to Brazilians, talked to some Israelis, and a whole bunch more. So there are places that see this possibility. The one tricky thing about it is if you look at our model, which is to get impact, we do get a lot of impact and we're proud to publish it, but it doesn't happen every time, even in our own country when we write in our own language. And so the notion of trying to continue that model in another country on our own has been one that has seemed pretty daunting. But having said that, I see still possibilities of international investigative reporting. There are literally whole swaths of the map where I'm sure if we had reporters, we could do great stories that would have real resonance both in those countries and in the United States.
The other thing that I would say is that we have heretofore been publishing for an American audience, but even with limiting ourselves to publishing principally for an American audience, although we are aware that it's a World Wide Web, and 10%, maybe 15% some days of the audience does actually come from outside the country. We have sent reporters overseas to do some very important stories over the years. A number of stories from Liberia, including one about a business, industrial, and economic and environmental problem there that we were very proud of. A lot of work on the terrorist incident in Mumbai that we spent a number of years working on, and others from time to time, as well as obviously a lot of the border coverage is very cognizant that there are two sides to the U.S. border, and especially a story that we did on a massacre that occurred in Mexico some years ago that I think was one of the most important border stories done in a long time.
Let's see. We've talked a little bit about, what it means to be nonpartisan and how we address sort of the both sides kind of thing. But we're still getting a lot of questions about how you really do this in practice. So how do your reporters maintain journalistic neutrality, neither opposing nor supporting any ideology, person, et cetera? With such fraught topics, this might be difficult. So how do you sort of, I guess?
Well, I mean, first of all, to be clear, I think you have to have reasonable expectations, and we have never expected that nobody who works for us has an opinion, right? I mean, people have opinions, they have viewpoints. There was famously an editor at the Washington Post who said, I don't want to go in a voting booth and vote because that will, I'll have a bias then. And I don't agree with that. We don't ask people to revoke their citizenship. Of course, we don't let our reporters, give to political campaigns or put signs in their lawns. But, if you want to, in your deepest, darkest heart, have a viewpoint, we're not going to stop you. But what we ask for, and what I think we have gotten, is what I would call professionalism. There is an ethic of journalism that says, regardless of what I think about this or what I think is the best course, I'm going to come to the subject with an open mind, as we've said, repeatedly in this. And I'm going to, report against myself. I'm going to ask questions like, well, what I think isn't true? What would that look like? What evidence could exist? And that is professionalism. And you start with the reporters, which I think a vast majority of ours start with that. And then you build an editing corps of experienced people who, work hard to keep that. And then, frankly, you have myself and Robin and Charlie Ornstein, our other managing editor, as hopefully a last line of defense there, reading every major story and asking the same kinds of questions. And, the questions we're asking are not, what do you think in your heart and soul? It's what's our evidence? Do we have the receipts? Can we prove it? Have we thought of other possibilities? Those are the questions we ask every day. And I think that's how you do this. We're not asking people not to have opinions.
So the question is framed in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have written it this way, but what can the media do to bring back those who bought into the lies of the last 4 years back to believing in facts? So, you were talking about the Trump administration sort of coming out saying like the media is the enemy of the people and all of that. I mean, for the people that sort of went that way, what can the media do to sort of get those folks back to a more fact-based media diet? That's the question.
Like all hard questions, I always give them to Robin.
Oh, thanks. Well, I think that this is a really tough and really important question because it's begun to feel a little like sometimes that people are living on different planets, and that, a lot of what's sort of sent them in these two different directions is disinformation, misinformation, that has just become so divisive in our culture that it is hard to figure out how to bridge it and how to reach people the way that we have traditionally reached them. I mean, we used to have more of an agreed upon set of facts. But I think that we are still committed to the idea that facts, first of all, can be proven and do have immense power when they are. And I think that we believe that there, is still a significant majority of people who can be reached with facts. And we are going to continue to try to do exactly that. I think that you can't throw up your hands and give up. And that's certainly not our plan.
Yeah, I mean, this is, in one sense, like everything, I think it's been accelerated by the internet, but we sort of have I think, a very false picture of the so-called past in which no American ever believed anything but factual things. I mean, if you go look it up, you'll see that a fair number of our fellow Americans believed Elvis was alive long after he died. So, I mean, there's a lot of people believe in, alien abductions. And again, when I say that, of course, I will now be abducted. But as far as I know, that's not a fact. I mean,
it will happen when he's gone.
That's right, exactly. I'll take a vacation, the aliens will grab me. But I mean, assuming for a moment that there are certain things that are non-factual, and yet they're believed by lots of people. And so, I think what you do to sort of answer that is what we've been doing, which is to show the receipts, show the video, show the documents, and try to write things in ways that are not, aggressively one-sided in the sense of sort of shutting people out from the conversation, which I think is possible without giving equal value or side to things that are clearly not true.
Well, on that note, that's actually our time for today. I want to thank our speakers for this excellent conversation, and thanks to you in the audience for your questions, and as always, for your generous support of ProPublica's work. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be doing more of these throughout the year, so please keep your eyes open for an email invitation in the next few months, and we hope to see you the next time. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.